title of this meeting is Fighting for the Schools Our Children Deserve. And I'm sure there's a lot of reasons that people came out here today for this event. But as one parent in Chicago, where they're fighting to stop the closure of some 120 some odd schools, put it, they seem to have the money to incarcerate children, but not educate children. And I think that that really cuts to the bottom of this whole debate about education reform. And so tonight we're going to be asking education reform for who and to what ends. And we have two great people here to speak on this. I'll just introduce both of them now. Actually, I'll introduce them as we go. They're going to have some time to talk about what education they envision, and then you'll have a chance to talk about what we think education should and could look like. Our first speaker is going to be Zavala. She is a member of an organization called Change the Stakes. She's a parent who lives uptown. And she's also an educator. Change the Stakes is an organization of parents and educators that's resisting the standardized test regime, which is causing so many of our schools to go into crisis and face uncertain futures. So many neighborhood schools getting shut down due to these standardized tests. So she's going to speak about that. I also want to mention something else about Diana that's important, which is that she was recently a plaintiff in a case that I just learned about from Brian, that kept the city from losing money that they were trying to tie to linking teacher pay to test scores with this whole Race to the Top initiative. And Diana is a plaintiff in this case that kept the city from losing that money. I don't know a lot about it. Maybe she and Brian can talk more about it. But that is an important victory. So thank you for that. And without anything else, I'll introduce Diana.
Well, I want to say that I'm really happy to be here with such a large crowd. I didn't know so many people would come out, but it just goes to show how important this topic is. And also, as we are sitting here talking about this kind of schools that we hope to have for our children and in our communities, others are uptown gathering, fighting a co-location at PS 132, which is a school that has been serving Washington Heights community for over 100 years. And it was slated for closure not too long ago, and parents and teachers fought to keep it open so that it didn't close after it had already been cut down and funds had already been taken away. And it had already started a process of engagement, which is just kind of, just the ball rolling towards getting closed. So parents were the ones who fought, and the community came together and fought to keep it open. And right after that, now we're fighting to keep it from being co-located. So it's like an ongoing struggle, but it just shows that parents and communities and people coming together really do create the victories that we need. And so it's empowering to think about, the kind of solutions that we can create. And that's kind of how I got to this place, to be here with you, Brian. And in this school where I spent many weekends with my son taking arts and music right here at Harlem School of the Arts, because the school that he's in doesn't have art and music. And so parents have to provide it somewhere. So like Monique said, I didn't come to this because I thought that I could do anything. I was only trying to protect my son. So I came to Change the Stakes because I realized that my son's education was being taken over by test prep, and that it wasn't healthy for him. So the personal becomes a political, and 1 year later, I realized that this is an important issue. And not only was I just resisting what I was seeing in my son, but I also saw that there were so many things wrong with the test. So it wasn't just about what it was doing to the students, but also what it was doing to schools and what it was doing to teachers, and how it was damaging, the communities. So back then I thought the tests were bad. I realized, the multiple choice questions were tricky. I knew that the passages were ambiguous. I thought that it was bad quality. And whenever I would speak about it, parents would say, well, what if they made tests better? What if, we just demand better tests? And I said, well, now, after having heard that so many times, I see that it really isn't about better tests. Now I see that even if the tests were better, I see that the kind of fear that teachers have when I speak to my son's teachers and they can't really express their own opinion. For example, I sent these flyers to their school saying, there's an election coming up. Would you guys be open to putting them out in teachers' mailboxes? Teachers couldn't even tell me what they thought about Moore, what they thought about the election. They were afraid of putting a flyer into other teachers' mailboxes. Wow. So to me, that shows just that it's not really about the test, but it's about the climate that the tests are creating in the schools and the kind of fear that teachers, work under, and the way that the relationship between the student and the teacher has been severed because of the test, and also the relationship between the teacher and the parent. So that's sort of the core of the damage that the tests have had just in education overall. So to me, so when I found that out, I realized that I wasn't alone. So here I was thinking, my poor son, he's so miserable. He's not my baby anymore. And then I realized that Change the Stakes was a group of parents. So I wasn't the only one, but a whole bunch of other people were feeling the same things and were doing something. So that's how we came together. And at the time, people didn't think like we were, we made any sense. We were saying, well, resist the test. This isn't good. And it wasn't easy to take that position. For example, for me, I got a letter from one of the parents in my son's school, a 4-page single-spaced letter saying why I was doing the wrong thing and how my son's school was going to be closed because I was being sort of selfish. And I know that others in Change the Stakes also had similar negative experiences. And scary. I mean, it really was scary to think that I was acting for my son's sake, but also I was impacting so many other people. So it was like, where does the responsibility end? Your own judgment versus the impact it has on a larger group. But as I came to think about it even more, I thought that in all the different struggles that we've had, like gay rights and climate change, when people come out and say something isn't right or they see a truth, others don't necessarily agree in the beginning. Mm-hmm. And it's only as we continue to say the same thing and make the same demands and, organize and come together that that we see true, evolution of something. So to me, finding Change the Stakes was really a great place because, just like we're fighting uptown and so many people are here today to talk about this, I see that it's within our hands to make the future possible. So as Monique said, before I came to Change the Stakes and was acted as a parent, I was also a teacher. And when I started out teaching, I was in my 20s and had just gotten out of school. And it was before Bloomberg. So I sort of have seen, there was, it was different before him. I sort of have seen not only how education has changed as a parent, but I've seen it as a teacher. When I started out, it was in a large school that had been labeled a failure. So the students were seen as failures, the teachers were seen as failures. There was just this overwhelming demoralization of you know, the climate in the school of the people that were in that building. And they just started breaking up the schools. So my school had 3 different schools within the mini school model was sort of the way of reform. At the time, it was very different with Rudy Cruz. So the school that I was in was a school that was called the Superintendent's District. So there was an idea that certain schools had more issues and they needed more resources. So in my school, it was separated as the Superintendent's District, and there was a lot of funds put in and a lot of teacher professional development and a lot of books and libraries. So the approach from Rudy Crew was to separate certain schools and to invest in them. But soon after, and it was also when the regions had just sort of been implemented in the high schools. Soon after that, Bloomberg comes in, and you know, he viewed that schools that were failing needed to be closed and needed to start being renamed and scattering the students and you know, just taking away the funds and raising the stakes. So that was what was wrong with sort of the system. They started to, so when you punish the schools based on the test scores, what happens is the curriculum is narrow and it becomes boring to students. And I saw that with the regions. The students were not engaged. They did not see what they were learning in the test prep as something that was meaningful. And unfortunately, what has happened is that most of the schools that get the most impact are schools in communities like Harlem, like Washington Heights, for students of color and for students who are second language learners. I was recently reading that New York City spends the least amount of money on each student per pupil. So communities like Scarsdale, in Westchester and Long Island, Great Neck, they spend almost $40,000 per student per year. And New York City spent, I know it's a huge amount of money. Meanwhile, New York City spends about, you know, $17,000 to $19,000. So that's about $8,000 less. So as a result, New York City has the lower graduation rates. They have the least arts and music and extracurricular activities. And the centerpiece of New York City schools is test prep. So it's absolutely true. My son, even though he has not taken any of the state tests, he comes home every day after 3 periods of math and 3 periods of ELA. He comes home with more test prep. And that's, you know, every day for a 9-year-old. So it's almost child abuse, you know. It's absolutely inappropriate for students to be under these kinds of learning conditions. So while the schools are losing funds, the funding that they do have, so the $19,000 that they are spending on students is being used for is being given over to corporations for textbooks. So the chancellor recently came out and said that the Common Core the Common Core curriculum has been rolled out, and that schools can now invest in buying textbooks and curriculum materials that will be implemented by September. So from 3 different vendors. To me, that's a waste of money. That's a waste because there were books before the Common Core. People were learning. And all of a sudden, let's just, you know, get rid of it and let's just spend money on something that's not tested, that we don't, you know, that we have no idea what it is. And the fact that it's being limited to 3 vendors, you know, I mean, that's pretty scary. It's very undemocratic. So other areas that I have seen like money being spent is on online tutoring and all these sort of iPads and get a degree online. And I think that those are misleading promises of what an education is like or should be like. Most importantly, I think that they have removed the value of what the role of the teacher. The teacher is not seen as important or valuable, and now a teacher who has experience and who would go in and be creative, and at the core you realize that they're committed to their students and they are interested and dedicated in that classroom, is no longer relevant to what the learning that the student is going to receive. So they become coaches, and it undermines their experience in their profession. And one of the biggest concerns, I think, for me and for other parents has been the possible sale of personal information, personal student data. That is one of the scariest things, that privacy is completely disregarded. And privacy is disregarded, and parents are disregarded, and students' health is disregarded, and this is just a very vicious circle to give into and to consent and to do nothing about. I'm also a speech therapist, and in my field, one of the biggest, if anything that I came out from Hunter College with, is the idea of privacy. You cannot even be in an elevator in a hospital or in any kind of medical setting and discuss a patient with another doctor or with another professional. You can't even suggest of the patient in room 3 or anything that may lead someone to know personal information of someone who is in the hospital. It is a very serious thing, and it doesn't seem like that's taken very seriously in the schools. In the schools, somehow parents are not told told anything about the test. Parents are not asked for consent, and they're certainly not being informed that students' information, including attendance, including truancy, including family background, foster homes, is being given over to a corporation called In Bloom, and there's another one, both of which are being designed by Bill Gates and Rupert Murdoch. So it is a very sick thing, and I think that the purpose of it is to track students from the minute they enter into the school system, to track them into the minute they leave. Of course, there's the school-to-prison pipeline that is probably being fed by the sale, as well as teacher tracking, record trackings. So to sum up sort of what I see as being at the center of this whole testing is this control over parents and control over the information and control over society. I think students are not being educated to become leaders, to become thinkers, but to sort of become cheap labor, or incarcerated, and to become obedient, most of all. So while I was thinking about this, I kind of wanted to think about thinking and think towards someone who can give us some truth about what's going on and say something that's beyond just my son and my experience. So I picked this quote from Foucault, that I thought sort of talks about some of the things that are going on. So he says, "It seems to me that the real political task in a society such as ours is to criticize the workings of institutions that appear to be both neutral and independent, to criticize and attack them in such a manner that political violence has always exercised itself obscurely through them will be unmasked so that one can fight against them." So this is how I interpret it. So in this quote, I think in the context of the school system is the language that that's being ingrained in our consciousness, such as Common Core, accountability, choice, achievement gap, Testing is good, you know, this kind of language that we're told is the norm, that we need to accept. It's normalizing our understanding of the world, and it's making us accept this as our reality. So these tools, and the teachers have the Danielson rubric, you know, which they're being trained, you know, the principals are being trained to use, and teachers are being trained to teach, you know, under. They're just real tools that serve the purpose of objectifying and making scientific the agenda. Mm-hmm. And it provides those in power the ability to exercise their power. And this is really just intended to enslave students and teachers and make them a part of the larger machine. So these technologies of life are setting the standard for what is normal and what is acceptable and what is efficient and economic, optimal. All of these in the education are, and all of those in the educations are decided by filtering, all these in the education system are decided by filtering children and teachers through testing, and it's the ultimate administrative control. So the testing is the filter by which all of these terms of accountability and Common Core and choice and all these things are being sifted through. And whatever comes out of these standards gets labeled and controlled. So whatever goes through is okay, but whatever doesn't go through this filter becomes a problem, and it becomes sort of separated. And there's a real structural function that the tests are serving. So this argument of education is in need of reform, that we need to do something about it, that it's really urgent that education be reformed and that schools change, is based on the premise of this achievement gap and that all students are not being equally educated. And this is presented to us as like, this is the truth, right? We all agree on this. You know, meanwhile, our parents went to school, many generations have gone to school, and somehow they've all managed. But suddenly, you know, that's not the case anymore. Because now what is at the heart of this is the teachers' union. Mm-hmm. It's breaking up the teachers' union and privatizing schools for profit, corporations, including selling the privacy and the humanity of students to a higher bidder. I think we need to move away from those methods of control into a more creative direction of coming up with alternatives. And while this is a pretty bleak picture, I think that we are not the only ones who feel this way. Across the world, across the globe, students and parents and communities are really fighting some of this privatization. And just across the map, you know, in California and Seattle, parents have fought and kept schools open, and students have refused to take the test, and teachers have boycotted administering the test. So everybody's sort of feeling this and doing something. And I think those are signs that what we're looking for is the real Common Core, and we are creating the Common Core that we want. So some of the highlights, or some of the things that I've seen that we already have models of what really works in education, I see in my son's school, believe it or not, where he has an IEP, so he's in a special ed program that is an inclusion class. It's called a NEST program. And now his class is made up of 17 students. There are 2 teachers in the classroom. I mean, like, the teachers in the room are probably like, wow, that's, you know, that's amazing. Because I think class size these days is over 25. Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah. Over 25, right? When I taught, it was 34, and sometimes I'd have 38 students on my roster, and, you know, it's impossible. So to have 17 students in the class is with 2 teachers is really a great size. And the students, so it's not just 17 students, but the students are also matched by abilities and personalities. So it's a very thoughtful grouping of students, which doesn't ever happen. I mean, I know as a teacher, the counselors would just throw students into classes based on availability. Or the student who came in late, well, let's not put him in English in first period because he's always going to be late. So let's give him English in the 7th period after lunch. So it was very, random. And the other school that I see as being another model of what really works in education is I work at the Julia Richmond Educational Campus, where there are 5 schools. A lot of them are progressive. I work in a District 75 school, so these are very impaired students. But there's the Urban Academy that they don't use testing as their way of promotion. So they use performance-based assessments, which are based on a student writing a report, defending a report. They go into depths of, on their studies. So they're not just given, all classes, but students sort of have a autonomy in choosing their classes, and they really go into what's meaningful to them. So those are examples of things that are already happening. And I think we just need to see them happen in our communities and in all schools. Other things that I think would make for for an appropriate education. I know this word appropriate is something that we have to get used to. I know when I was fighting for my son's IEP, I was like, don't say he deserves the best. No, you can never say he deserves the best. He just deserves an appropriate education. So those are the legal terms. But we know better. It's crazy. We know that what we want is a first-rate education. And I think, for starters, I made a list. Okay, so here it goes. For starters, small class sizes is unanimous. We need more resources and we need funding. As we know, cuts because of political reasons, against the teachers, once again, are not acceptable. They do impact the schools, and they impact learning and programs, and just our students. They impact the students. We need a supportive environment for students, individual learning. Not all students learn the same way, and this Common Core is assuming that this one model fits everyone. And in my experience, I see in my building, my District 75 students cannot learn, Common Core curriculum, and yet they are being forced to sit through the savannas and Mesopotamia, and they're nonverbal, and they're not being taught to, tie their shoes or open a doorknob, but they're being taught to, know about Africa. So it's just, a more suitable curriculum for them is what we should be looking for everybody. Supportive environment for teachers, so we actually keep teachers, and we have experienced teachers, and teachers stay in the communities that they work in. We need libraries and music rooms and art rooms. And another thing that it just blows me away, that students don't have physical education. And it is physical education, not gym.
Right.
But these students, especially boys, boys are full of energy. Oh, God. I mean, I have one of each, and I see the difference. So, they need an outlet. And simple things like getting the kids out to play would make a huge difference in their learning, but they're not doing it. They need field trips regularly, why are they learning about art when they can go to the museum when we're living in New York City? We need an empowering curriculum that liberates the students and makes them reflect on their circumstances and leads them to action. Instead of being passive, I think we need a curriculum that inspires people to do something about society. And we need an end to high-stakes testing and a respect for privacy. And just to say the last words, I think those are the things that we need, but we gotta stay true to some of the truths that we already know, and some of the things that really come from, the lessons you learn in kindergarten or the lessons you learn at home. And I think punishment just doesn't work. If you're a parent, you know it doesn't work. And the way to get cooperation is just through rewards and support and education and encouragement and fairness and openness and respect. And those are the things that should be added to the list of libraries and physical ed. But using that approach is how I see education as.
Thank you, Diana. Our next speaker is Brian Jones. He is a teacher for 9 years in the classroom. He was a co-narrator of the documentary The Inconvenient Truth Behind Waiting for Superman, and he's a member of the movement of rank-and-file educators, which is the social justice caucus of the UFT that Diana was referencing. Brian.
We are in a dire situation in public education. In some cities in this country, public education as we've known it is ceasing to exist as we sit here. New Orleans, Detroit, Philadelphia, ceasing to exist. The people who are in charge of public education, we can talk about the corporations and Bill Gates. Let's talk about the people who are in charge of public education, who have jumped on the business logic bandwagon and who themselves deeply believe. I'm talking about the chancellor. I'm talking about the U.S. Secretary of Education, who themselves deeply believe that what the schools need is to be run more like a business, that we need to replace the public nature of the schools, the public, universal, free nature of them, with more of a free market model for schooling. Those are the people in charge. Now, many of us are long-standing critics of the public schools. And right now we're in this weird situation where we are still critics of public schools and defenders of the public nature of the schools. We're critical because still, in too many places, the schools as they are not the schools that our children deserve. In too many ways, too many of our schools still resemble factories, which itself is the leftover product of the last business craze from over 100 years ago, when they hit upon Taylorism as a miracle method inside the factories. We're going to break down every task of the workman to a discrete task, to a discrete entity, and then squeeze as much productivity out of that task, make you do it as quickly and as fast as possible. And once they discovered that brilliant way of making more money in the factory, they thought that should be the organizing principle of every workplace, every office, hospital. No, it should be the organizing principle of life. And so that's why we got Taylorist schools. And that's what we're still stuck with. And on top of that, we have to talk about the deep tradition of racial injustice in this country when it comes to schools. African Americans brought here, and it was illegal to learn or to go to school on punishment of death. Actually, as I started digging into this, I ended up contributing a chapter to this book, Education and Capitalism. My chapter is on the struggle for black education. It's a story again and again of black parents, children, students, teachers fighting for education and thwarted with institutional racism again and again and again over hundreds of years. An inspiring and daunting story. In the 1960s, things shifted, and actually, for the first time in a while, progressive ideals in education, constructivism, child-centered learning, came back, made a comeback. Now, why is that? Well, you just have to ask yourself what was happening in the 1960s. That in a period of time where millions of people took to the streets, and by organizing, by shouting, marching, by pressing their demands on the world, but to try to change the world, of course, when millions of people are challenging racism, sexism, war, challenging the conditions of work, challenging homophobia, when they're challenging everything that they had grown up to think, and they begin to see the world as intolerable as it is, of course, they're going to say that education cannot teach children to just fit into the world as it is. And that's why our schools began to change and began to try to develop the inherent powers in children. People began to have the idea, and it wasn't just the Black Panthers or the civil rights activists who developed the freedom schools. It began to be a popular idea that children's individual intellectual and creative powers had to be tapped into. Now, unfortunately, we don't have this is not the 60s, we don't have an earth-shaking movement like that today. We're in a much weaker position. And I think that our weakness is the essential prerequisite for all of this craziness that's going on today. There's no way that the business leaders could just come into our schools and run roughshod over us if we were not so in a disorganized state. And I really think there's a lot of debate about this. I really think we don't have to call this some kind of nefarious conspiracy to understand that every society in history tries to reproduce itself, one way or another. For most of human history, that took place in the family or even later in the workplace, although for most of history, that was the same thing. In capitalist society, we have this special institution, separate from the family and separate from the workplace, to prepare young people, and it's called school. And it's natural then that in school, there's going to be some kind of a preparation for society. So when they've got the crazy Taylorist ideal, of course it's got to be in the school. It's unthinkable that school would be organized on some other principle. Now, what is the organizing principle of our working lives? Data. Whether you work at Walmart, UPS, FedEx, McDonald's, it doesn't matter where you work, but they are gathering data, preferably real-time data, on your productivity. And they have discovered this has become a revolution in the way that they organize their workplaces and squeeze more productivity out of you. It is unthinkable to them that this new organizing principle not become the organizing principle of schools. And if young people are going to then go from school into the workplace, it is unthinkable to them to leave the schools untouched by this and not have students at the youngest ages deeply internalize the idea that they are to live and die by the numbers. That good things will flow to them if they keep their numbers up, and bad things will happen to them if their numbers are not up. And I'm talking 3- and 4-year-olds. If you don't demonstrate this skill in a measurable way on this exam, pre-K student, your teacher might be out of a job, you might repeat pre-K, your principal will be out of a job, and your school might be closed. People were excited about Obama's saying we're going to have universal pre-K. Problem, in the fine print it says it has to have measurable outcomes or we're closing it. What? They're teaching us at the youngest ages that this is the way of life and that you should get used to it. Of course, profiteering is a factor. Crude, crass profiteering. People who are just out to make, of course, that is part of the landscape. Of course. The Wall Street Journal rejoiced when the Common Core standards were announced. Because now, instead of Pearson having to develop a test for Missouri and a different one for New York and a different one for California, they could sell one test to every single state. This is a huge windfall for the test makers. The architect of the standards, David Coleman, said that kids need to read less fiction and write fewer personal narratives because, and I quote, when you grow up in this world, you realize people don't give a shit about what you think or feel. Isn't he a great educator? The good news is that a growing number of parents, teachers, and students, that's a quote. This is the man who's now designed the curriculum that's going to guide us all into the brave new world. Isn't that great? The good news is that a growing number of parents, teachers, and students disagree with David Coleman and are getting wise about what this is all about. And I think Deanna's right that high-stakes testing in some ways is the sharpest point on this, and in some ways is the thing that's waking people up right at this moment. In Seattle, you may have heard that a group of teachers unanimously voted to refuse to administer a standardized test. And the superintendent tried to punish them, but they got so much support from the students, from the parents, from the community, from the nation, that the superintendent was unable to punish the teachers, even though they directly disobeyed an order and refused to administer the test. Even more dramatic was last year's Chicago Teachers Union strike, where a group of teachers proved that you could stand up to this corporate education reform and live to talk about it and continue to exist. They boldly, the Chicago Teachers Union boldly called the schools in Chicago an apartheid school system. They pointed out which kids had libraries and which kids didn't, and that it fell exactly on the complexion of the kids who lived in the area. And the kids with the wrong complexion did not have the libraries, did not have the science labs, did not have the art classes, did not have the things that the paler and wealthier kids had. They pointed out that Democratic Party officials like Rahm Emanuel were hypocritically sending their kids to schools that looked totally different, where they took none of these tests and where they had everything that you would want for kids. Ironically, some of this child-centered, constructivist, kind of progressive ideals in education, you have to ask yourself, what's the repository of those ideals in today's school? Ironically, it's in the private schools. Ironically, the richest people in our country are sending their kids to schools that are organized along those ideals. minus, of course, the elitism, but where, that kind of an education is taking place. Obama sends his daughters to the Sidwell Friends School, which is a Quaker school, where every month kids, starting in the first grade, write questions that are going to be guiding questions for their studies and for their work as a community. They've been doing this for 25 years. For example, a second grade question that the kids wrote together to guide themselves was, do you have the courage to stand up to your friends when they are not being fair and just to others? They don't take tests. They're not worried about tests. They're not worried about passing a test. They're worried about themselves, their personal development, and their role in the community. Wow, wouldn't that be a nice way to organize schools? It's interesting that the things that we've been arguing for decades, that they say we don't need, that they say are not the issue, the things we've been crying for years, more resources, rich curriculum, not just reading and math, experienced teachers, not just grinding through newbies, and small class sizes. Those things are precisely the things that are institutionalized in the elite schools in this country. The Sidwell Friends Academy in pre-K, it's 11-to-1 teacher ratio. K to 2, 12-to-1. 3rd and 4th grade, 12-to-1. 5th and 6th grade, 16-to-1. 16-to-1. Then go to 7th and 8th grade, back down to 12-to-1. 9th through 12th grade, 13-to-1. The Spence School, where Bloomberg sent his daughters, 17 per class in elementary, 14 per class in middle school and high school. Bloomberg says class size doesn't matter. When it comes to meeting our students' basic needs, there's never any money. But when it comes to data gathering, there's a blank check.
That's right.
We're about to spend $32 million over 5 years to pay Pearson to make more tests. Wait, you said there's no money. You said we're dry. In 2011, Deanna referred to this, the comptroller did a sampling, an audit of 31 schools, a random sampling of 31 schools in 5 boroughs. Not one school was meeting the minimum standard for physical education. Not one school. The minimum standard required by the state was not being met. Meanwhile, at the Spence School, for just their 700 students, they have 6 science labs, 6 art studios, 2 music rooms, 1 computer lab, 1 dark room, 2 gyms, but the woman in the front is right. It's not just gym, it's physical education. So in addition to their 2 gyms, they have 2 performance spaces, 2 dance studios, and 2 libraries. So when we're talking about the schools that our children deserve, for starters, we'll take what they have. We'll take what they have. Got to repeat it because I'm not sure what I'm saying. Oh yeah, here it is. If it's good enough for their children, it's good enough for ours. And when they ask us, how will you pay for this extravagance? We'll ask, how do you pay for it? Here's an idea. Let's end the sweetheart contracts with Pearson, with Wireless Generation, that's Murdoch. Let's end the sweetheart contracts with the edu vultures. Let's start collecting rent from the charter schools that are operating for free in public school buildings. Let's end the contract with Teach for America because our students deserve experienced teachers. And actually, we spend more on Teach for America recruits than we do on students coming out of the schools of education. Let's end the money that the tens of millions of dollars that's going to data collection, data systems, test development. Let's end the 6-figure salaries for data analysts right now that they're hiring. As we sit here, they are literally developing music standardized tests before they have even made sure that every student even has a music teacher. That is a sin. And that has to end. I heard a woman who came before me and some of my colleagues defend the Common Core standards with the way that they deprioritize personal narratives. She said, well, when you get to college, you really don't write that many personal narratives, so what are we preparing the kids for? Later, about 30, 45 minutes later in the conversation, somebody who was still a critic, a teacher, was still a critic of the Common Core standards after her presentation, was still arguing with her and said, look, I feel like I have no voice here. I feel like nobody's listening to what I have to say. My voice doesn't make a difference. She said, no, your voice does make a difference. Let me tell you what you need to do. You need to meet with your legislators. You need to meet with your legislators. You need to meet with the regents. You need to talk to them face to face. And when you do, when you find yourself in an audience with them, tell them a story. Tell them, and with no irony, she said, and no awareness. She said, tell them your story. Tell them a specific story from your, that's right, a personal narrative. And in fact, she used that phrase. She said, don't you know that's how laws get passed? She said, don't you know that's the most powerful thing that you can do? Look, people, they want to say we need an education to prepare kids for the world, to fit in and get a job and blah, blah, blah. No, 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 no. Of course we want students to be competent to operate in the world. But the schools that our children deserve should be about much more than that. We don't want to just teach children to accept the world the way it is. We have to figure out an education system that can prepare them to change this world, to be critical of this world, to see it for what it is. And that means learning your stories, the stories of your people, and being able to learn about your own story and learn how to tell it. And if that is so powerful, then absolutely our kids must learn how to do that. And the fact that they don't want to teach them how to do that should tell you something. David Coleman might be right. It might be right that Walmart and McDonald's and UPS and Google don't give a shit what you think or feel, what our kids think or feel, but we do. That's right. And the schools that our children deserve should too. Thank you.